works have been translated into languages too many to enumerate, but she's written and presented documentaries for the National Geographic, BBC, Discovery Channel, PBS, the History Channel, and Channel 4. She's a scholar at Oxford University, holds an honorary doctorate from the University of York, and her programs are annually seen by no fewer than 250 million people. Would you please welcome to the stage, Bettany Hughes. Hello, Bettany.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Very good.
What's
Lovely.
your best side?
Does it matter? Maybe here.
As you wish.
Yes, I think that's
As you wish.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for welcoming me here today. What a total delight it is. I've been in town for 3 days talking a lot about tolerance and collaboration, so it is a true pleasure to be here. We're going to do this session as a chat, as a dialogue. I think it was advertised somewhere as being about Athens. We're going to talk about Athens, but we're mainly going to talk about Istanbul, as you can see. And we thought we'd just start with a couple of clips. As Paul has said, I've dedicated my life to communicating the past, and there's a rather kind of brilliant thing for us historians, that we always knew that the past mattered, that where you came from informs where you go, that we should never live in the past, but that we're fools if we don't admit that we live with it. And rather fantastically, scientists have now caught up with us and neuroscientists tell us that we carry memory right across our brains, that we cannot have a future thought unless we access a memory of some kind. So philosophically and physiologically, memory matters. And what I find incredibly helpful about looking at the past is seeing those moments where cultures and civilizations and faiths have collaborated to produce a beautiful society. And I think there are really cogent lessons that we can learn. So what we thought we'd do is, just before we start to talk about Istanbul, which is my latest book, we just show you a couple of very brief clips from a program that I made about Al-Andalus, about the civilization of Al-Andalus. Very interestingly, just to let you know that when we were persuading the broadcasters to make this program, they were a bit anxious about it. They said that they were worried about using the words Europe in the title, because Europe was a kind of off-putting word, and they wouldn't even let us use the word Islam in the title. So it's actually called When the Moors Ruled Europe. But as you'll see, we're just going to show you the pre-titles for this, and then a very short clip. And really what it does is it drills down and tries to analyse and celebrate why it was that that extraordinary moment, 700 years in the history of Europe, produced such a spectacular and beautiful and flourishing civilization.
Fantastic.
So if we could have the first clip, which is pre-titles, and then go straight on to the second clip, which is Seville. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. VT man. Here we go.
The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus is about to embark on his world-shattering voyage to the Americas. And on his way to the coast, he stops off here at Granada. He's the honoured guest of a ceremony hosted by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella.
Wow.
They are celebrating a grand victory. Up until this day, Granada had been ruled by Muslims. But Isabella has managed to wrestle control from them.
Ferdinand and Isabella's victory marks a turning point for Spain and for Europe. The Middle Ages are over, and the West is about to embark on a new epoch of power and discovery.
We tend to think of this as the beginning of an era. In fact, it's the climax of a forgotten chapter in European history: the rise and fall of Islam in the West.
And if we can have
Number
the
2.
second clip.
He's on it.
Good man.
Here we go.
When the Christian King Peter took control of Seville in 1248, this is what he had made. It is a beautiful building. It was built for a Christian, and yet in every way it resembles an Islamic palace. On the walls there are inscriptions from the Quran, and above the door there are dedications to its owner, calling him Caliph rather than king.
The conqueror has been conquered by the culture.
It's a tiny bit unexpected that when this Christian king rebuilt this palace, he made it appear so Arabic. It feels as if we're in the Alhambra here.
Well, this palace has many relations with the Alhambra, especially with the Court of Lions. Both builders, King Muhammad V of Granada and King Peter I of Castile, were friends. You have to consider that in Europe, at this time, there was not an architecture of such a splendor comparable to Al-Andalus. And this made a very big attraction for the Christians. And this is why this architecture was used by the Christian to show to the nobility of the kingdom the power, the authority, this room covered with this marvelous dome. It symbolized a power because it's the heavens that turns around the king.
But the legacy of Al-Andalus was to affect more than the architecture of Europe. In the midst of this terrible struggle, something incredible was to happen, which would fire the minds of Europeans and expand our intellectual horizons.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bettany. Well, that's a really good example of the sort of 14th, 15th century, the world being in a state of flux and the rise of Islam and its reach towards the Western Mediterranean. Your latest book, Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities, of course, brings the Islam world right back to the heart of the Eastern Mediterranean, the other end of that sea. But of course, now we're in a state of massive political and social flux here in the 21st century. Why was now the right time, do you think, to write this book, to publish this book?
Well, actually the same reason to make that programme and to write this book, that there is a terrible amnesia in society. So I don't know about you, but when I was at school, I was brought up being told that there was the ancient world, the classical world, and there was the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, and in between that there was something called the Dark Ages, as if nothing happens. And we all know as humans, and I certainly know as a historian, there is no such thing as a dark age. There is no moment when the lights of civilization are turned out. But what matters is who is telling the story. So who's celebrating what happens. And as you've seen from those couple of clips, we were really trying in the film to talk about this extraordinary moment, as I said, of communication and collaboration and this wonderful flourishing in Al-Andalus of civilization, and not just Islamic civilization, but a shared Islamic, Christian, Jewish civilization as well. And the same really applied for the Istanbul book, that I got very sick of people talking about it as being a Byzantine city and then an Ottoman city, and forgetting that it had this incredible backstory, you know, that Istanbul is a city that's been inhabited for 800,000 years. So that's kind of before we're even properly human. So that is quite a long time that shouldn't ever just be reduced to these kind of headline moments. So I just wanted to write the story back in. But also, as a historian, you have to have facts, you have to have evidence. And because Istanbul was going through a period of regrowth, the Bosphorus tunnels were being built, and there was a new metro system, I know that when a city is creating a new future for itself, it always turns up its past. So I knew that there'd be this incredible wealth of archaeology to investigate, which there was to the power of X.
It's that whenever you develop, it's like the palimpsest of human evolution. You get to dig down through it. Were there any dangers in approaching this subject at this time?
I mean, there were. It's, as you know, it's quite a politically, how should we put it, sensitively active place at the moment. So I did find that when I was in the city, I got caught up in protests and coups, and completely inadvertently, I was just there minding my own business, you know.
With the coup when they were trying to get rid of
Yeah,
Erdogan.
so I seemed to be there at kind of all the times. Just as I said, I was sort of quietly working in a library, and then you know, geopolitics would explode around me. So it was history in the making. So there was a sort of minor physical risk when I was there, but I think also the fact that actually, if you're writing a book, it took 10 years to write this book, and you can see it's quite chunky. And I think in a way the risk was the fact that with great maritime cities, so with Istanbul, and I would argue with the cities here of the Emirates, because they are maritime cities, when you tell their story, you're also telling the story of a wider world. So I really wanted to try to understand the story of the world through this city. So the danger was how much I could leave out and how much I had to put in while making a book that it still wasn't going to be weighing down everybody's suitcase and impossible to carry around.
There's only so much we're going to be able to cover today, obviously with a book that thick, but where does the city's journey start?
Yeah, well, so again, fascinatingly, as some of you know, I've written a lot about the ancient Greeks. And the Greeks who invented the term history are therefore very good at writing themselves into history. So they're very good at telling us that they founded the city of Byzantium, that then became Byzantium under the Romans, and then Constantinople, and then Istanbul. But of course that's not true. Of course there's an incredible native story to the city. And that's what all this new archaeology has shown. And I'll just see if I can share with you a couple of things. This is just to show you the classic case that this is a multicultural, multi-ethnic city. But if we go right the way back to its very beginnings, you start with this, on the face of it, slightly uninteresting object. I showed this slide in Oxford last week, and somebody asked me if it was an avocado holder. Not an avocado holder, something much more interesting, ladies and gentlemen. What you're looking at there is an 8,000-year-old footprint. And when this archaeology was being rescued during the development projects in Istanbul, they discovered the whole story of the prehistoric city, and it's an amazing story. So there are actually settlements in Istanbul, really proper little communities from around 6,000 BCE, so 8,000 years ago. And this is the footprint of one of the men. We know that it was a man who lived in the city. There are also the footprints of children and women, some of them with bare feet, some with little leather shoes on.
This is a shoe?
Yeah, it's a shoe, exactly. So it's a leather shoe. And there are 2,000 of these footprints that have been rescued and are now being held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. And we've got all this other amazing evidence from that time. So it was a beautiful place. It was a place where there were oak forests and pistachio forests and chestnut forests. We've so far recorded 9,000 species of flora. So you have to imagine this kind of absolutely sort of idyllic, almost kind of paradise-like place. All kinds of things have come up out of the mud as well. Beautiful spoons made of wild cow bone. The world's oldest wooden canoe paddle, if you're interested in boats. The world's oldest wooden coffin with this 30-year-old woman curled up inside it. So we really have this sense of this kind of vigorous early community living in this rather beautiful place.
It's a very naive question, forgive me for it, but is this at this point, is this east or west of the Bosphorus, or is it both sides?
It is the most brilliant question, because actually the Bosphorus hasn't yet been invented. So an incredibly apposite question. So at this moment, east and west are literally physically joined. So there is no Bosphorus. But what happens then, around 7,600 years ago, is a huge geoseismic event when the sea levels rise. I mean, must have been absolutely petrifying for these communities who were living there, because over a space of 300 days, the sea levels rise by 268 feet. So if you can imagine that, just watching the sea rise, 600 miles of land is flooded, 10 cubic meters worth of water, 10,000 cubic meters worth of water come flooding over the land lip and creates the Bosphorus, which you can, hopefully, if we can move on. Yeah, you can see here. So this is what happens. Suddenly that Bosphorus channel is created. And that destroyed lives, but also in a way that made the possibility for Istanbul to be a world-class city, because suddenly it's a place that has a narrow connection between east and west, but also, most importantly, there's this huge connection between north and south. So if you're in the Black Sea, you can travel through the Bosphorus and then straight down, kind of next stop, Africa. So it was a sort of a life-changing, world-changing moment, that. And I'll just give you a little fact. If you're going to visit Istanbul, or if anybody in the room is planning to visit Istanbul, the Bosphorus, if you've ever been on it, is very choppy. The water's there. Sailors hate sailing on it. It's very unpredictable. The tides and the direction of the water changes 9 times over the 20 kilometres of the Bosphorus. Absolutely treacherous. But there's a reason for that when the Bosphorus was formed with this huge geoseismic event, underneath the Bosphorus, the mud and the screes scoured out an underwater river. So under the Bosphorus, under the sea, there is an underwater river flowing in the opposite direction.
Counter.
Incredible. And if that river was on land, it would be the 6th biggest river in the world.
Good God.
So that's a huge mass of water, which is now explains when you get on one of those ferries, sometimes it goes like this a bit. It's because there's this churn. So it was, as I said, devastating for some people, and we know that there is flooding. We know that under the flooding, you can see the villages, the prehistoric villages, but also something which, in a way, gave the city its character and made it this city that lives for and by water.
My old tutor would be delighted that finally my Oxford DPhil in geology has come useful
Yes.
in a literary context.
Excellent.
So you've dealt with the Greek creation myth that didn't happen. What did the Greeks do for Istanbul? They obviously were there. They may not have formed it, but they played a key role in its development, I assume.
They did, yes. So, we mustn't be too rude about the Greeks. They certainly saw the potential of this great city. Now, I just want to show you, these are some of the examples of the things that they found. So the Greeks, as I said, claimed they'd found it. They called the city Byzantium after their great hero, Byzas. But actually, the archaeology in the city, every excavating season is proving that there were others before them. And I just wanted to show you this, because this was excavated just as I was finishing the book. So this is a Thracian burial. I know, dates to around about 2000 BCE, so it's about 4,000 years old.
Wow.
Right in the centre of the city, just to the west of the centre. And what's really fascinating about this is a Thracian burial. So it shows that there were Thracians in the city, but it's in that very typical Central Asian shape. I don't know if any of you know the kurgans, the great round burials of Central Asia. So there's a possibility that there were Central Asians in Istanbul, even 4,000 years ago, but certainly there's an influence that is coming from Central Asia to the city. And again, the poor gentleman whose tomb this is still buried there. You can see he's again curled up in this kind of fetal position. But this is 4,000 years old. So this predates the Greeks in the city by at least 1,300 years.
But even at that stage, it was already a nexus. The argument is it was already a nexus between different civilizations, from Thracians to Central Asians to so on.
Absolutely.
That's extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. And for me, you can't get away from the fact that is why it's a city that works. It's why it's the longest lived city in Europe. It's flourished for 8,000 years, and I think it's because it's this place where ideas and influences combine.
We can't mention sort of ancient or classical history, having started with Greeks, without mentioning Romans.
Yes.
So what led to the decline of the Greek influence in Istanbul and the rise of Roman influence?
Well, so the Romans, I'm much keener on the Greeks than I am on the Romans. I admire the Romans. they kind of send a chill down my spine because they are just so extraordinarily ambitious.
They're the Facebook of classical
Exactly. I've just done a little new film about the god of war, the Roman god of war Mars, and asking why it is that people worship war, and we kind of come to the conclusion that, again, the very best civilizations recognize it's life that is sacred, not war. But the Romans are really interesting because the Greeks, with their god of war, Ares, they were very troubled by Ares, and they said that the children of Ares were discord and panic and chaos and fear. Whereas the Romans, because they're a military society, they succeed only through military expansion, they need to turn the god of war into something heroic. So whereas the Greeks, really interestingly, you don't find Greek temples to Ares much at all, to their god of war. Mars, the Roman god of war, is worshipped everywhere, huge, hero cults. There are Mars boys' clubs, interestingly, in the colonies where young locals, so in Tunisia, for instance, in the beautiful city of Maktar, we've uncovered this incredible thing, which is literally a young men's association in honor of Mars. So the young men are encouraged to worship this warmongering god to make them feel as though they belong to the Roman Empire, that they have a purpose in it, and that they're therefore ready to fight if called upon.
So it's sort of a cult, as a Mars
cult.
It
is absolutely a Mars cult, and that's one of the ways that Rome manages to be so successful, is it encourages this Mars cult with the young men. We're slightly going off piste from Istanbul,
yes.
but it is, I agree, it's really, really fascinating. So if you look at, and the same happens to Istanbul. So Istanbul is a Greek city, and this is just to show you the kind of city as it is at the time of both the Greeks and the Romans. So it becomes a Greek city. Again, really interestingly, why it not just survives but thrives, I think, is because it's a city that is Greek, but it takes on board local influences. So the dialect there, we know, has sort of Thracian roots and loan words. They collaborate a lot with the East. A lot of the gods that they worship are both Eastern as well as Greek. So we have amazing, powerful female goddesses like Cybele who are worshipped there. So it's a very robust Greek city. But the Romans recognize that it's hugely worth their while taking over what is Byzantium for two reasons. One is because it's a brilliant place to basically have a military base, because you have access to east-west. Hugely strategic, east-west, north and south. And also, the Romans recognize they can make a lot of money out of this city because it's such a trading hub. And the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn are thick with fish, so there's a huge fish trade that comes from Byzantium. Interestingly, just so you know, that little snick of water that's called the Golden Horn, we think it was called that because it was so thick with fish that the surface of the water would literally shimmer with these kind of diamond bright scales. It would just sparkle out. So that's why it's called golden. So the Romans, as I said, they basically recognize they can make a lot of money from taxing trading boats up and down the Bosphorus. They can trade from there, and they can use it as a kind of military base.
And are the Romans still calling it Byzantium as the Greeks did?
Yes, so the Greeks call it Byzantion, and the Romans call it Byzantium. And I think we forget, it's one of those really important moments where we have to recalibrate and stop telling history from a Western point of view. Because actually, the Romans, we think of the Romans as being based in Rome. It's the Roman Empire.
Yes.
As I said, it falls because of barbarians. And then there's nothing, and then there's the Renaissance. And that is total nonsense. So the Romans actually recognized that Istanbul, that the East, is the place where they should really base their power and their resources. And we know this from this rather brilliant remain in the city. Who's been to Istanbul in the audience? Everybody, wonderful, great. So hopefully you love it. So I don't know whether you noticed this monument when you were there. It's the most unprepossessing, hopeless, neglected monument, given how incredibly important it is in world archaeological terms. So this is just next to, it's just across from the Blue Mosque, just in front of Hagia Sophia, just next to the Hippodrome. It's right in the centre of the city. In fact, if you go to the to the baths, to the famous baths with the underground cisterns in Istanbul. It's just outside that. Everybody walks past it, though. I mean, when I was last there, there were kind of sweet wrappers and fag papers and a cat giving birth at the bottom. But, you know, so I said it's neglected. But what you're looking at the base of that column, that is the Roman level of the city. And what this is the remains of a thing called the Milion.
Right.
And the Milion was the mother of all mile markers in the Roman Empire. So this was literally the point zero from which all distances in the Roman world were measured. And isn't that fascinating that that's in Istanbul? It's not in Rome, it's in the east, it's in Istanbul.
It's like Charing Cross in central London for any distances, mile markers in the UK.
Completely.
Now, forgive my naivety, and I know it's not on the thing we programme, but I have some vestigial memory of having been taught, having read somewhere, that at one point the seat of the Roman Empire was moved from Rome to Constantinople, to Byzantium.
Yes.
And it became the centre of the Roman Empire. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. So Istanbul then becomes called the Second Rome, the New Rome, and it's where the Roman emperors are based. So,
which emperor? Do we know which one moved the centre?
Well, Septimius Severus is the one who sets up this monument.
Who builds the Great Wall.
But yeah, and he's of African descent.
Right.
So he's Eastern anyway. So he's saying the East matters.
Okay.
So sort of emotionally and practically, this is where the power is. Of course, the emperor who officially moves the Roman Empire to what we now call Istanbul is Constantinople. Constantine.
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 Constantinople.
Exactly, who then calls this city Constantinople. And he recognizes that this is amazingly strategic. Again, he understands that there has to be this communication between East and West. So this is the new Rome. So this is where Rome operates. And I think we need to kind of rethink our ideas that Rome never really fell. It just moved 800 miles east and became an eastern city.
Do we have any sense of what it was like as a city under Roman times? Is there any evidence to show us how it worked? Was it sort of very much under the Roman model of, SPQR, Senatus Popularesque Romana? Was it still the same thing, or was it a little freer?
It's really interesting. It's basically mimics Rome in many ways. So there is a senate, there are chariot races, there's a praetorian guard, all these things that you'd expect. All those Roman institutions move, but it does become freer. It becomes a bit more open-minded. It sort of takes on the benefits of the East. And there are kind of wonderful, I just wanted to show you some of the new archaeology that we have that tells us about this city. So this is, if any of you are historians or archaeologists, you'll recognize how amazing this is.
Yeah.
So this is a boat that dates back to the 4th century AD. So it's 1600, 1700 years old, almost perfectly preserved. And the reason it's been preserved is that it was kept in the Bosphorus mud. So it was in a harbour, the Theodosian harbour. We think there was actually a tsunami, probably, because all the boats have ended up at the bottom of the sea, which is terrible, of course, for those people who are in them, but good for us as historians. There are 37 of these whole boats that have been discovered so far, and they have incredible remains in them. So there are bowls of cherries that have survived, ship's rope, absolutely perfect, unrotted ship's rope. There's even the captain's little brazier with his food, with his last meal on it. I mean, truly, truly incredible things. And what there also is, I have to say, is a lot of amphorae of wine. So I think it was quite a boozy city. It's the kind of Dubai to Abu Dhabi. I think not there's booze in Dubai, but it was the kind of party city, I think. And a huge amount of wine was imported there. And it does have this reputation in the ancient world for being this kind of party city where, basically what happened in Byzantium stayed in Byzantium.
Are there any written testament? Do we have any extant documents that support this?
Yes, we do. Well, exactly right. So the ancient authors talk about Byzantium as being this beautiful city, this city which makes people drunkards, this city where wine is worshipped. So for us as historians, it's amazing that we've read these texts and we thought, they were just exaggerating. But now the archaeology is showing us that it is actually true. Yeah.
And I suppose with the tsunami, sudden inundation of water, the boats go under the water, covered with silt, anoxic environment, nothing rots.
Exactly.
1,600 years of preservation.
Total preservation.
Thank goodness for it, for those good not to be there.
Yeah.
Do we have any information on characters that lived in Istanbul at
Yes.
the time? Sorry, Constantinople
Nople.
at the time, forgive me.
Yes.
Do we have any sort of, I know documentation and extant records are always very difficult and hard to come by, but did people keep diaries? Were there any sort of town documents of crimes and misdemeanors or court records or anything like this?
There are, luckily for us, there are. And so you can get a real sense of the city from those documents. And what really fascinates me, I wasn't expecting to find this when I wrote the book, is that one of the reasons that I think it is such an extraordinarily strong city, and as I said, we mustn't forget, this is a city that was a capital city for 3,000 years.
Yeah.
Most cities rise and fall. You know, it held on to its power. And I think one of those reasons, it was a city which had a very strong sense of social justice.
Oh.
So right from its very beginning, because it was open-minded, because it was a maritime city, it was very happy to welcome in strangers. So welcomed in refugees right from the very beginning. And we actually have this amazing document that tells us that they had a special refugee official for the city. So, I mean, this was in the 4th century again, so, you know, incredibly ahead of its time, because they recognised that those from outside could bring in new goods, new ideas, they weren't necessarily a bad thing. And you can see that, I think, in how Constantine the Great, sort of his ideas when he set it up. Just to show you, this is the column of Constantine that still exists on the left-hand side. This is how it looks now. Now it's 115 foot tall. Originally it was 160 foot tall, tops with this figure of Constantine the Great presenting himself as, he's kind of hedging his bets, basically. He's showing himself as Christ and the sun god Apollo and a Roman emperor and a kind of Christianized saint all in one. So it's that real mixture of Greek and Roman, East and West. But what is really fascinating about Constantine is that he says to the world, this is a city of sanctuary, and that if you can get into the gates of the city will provide you with sanctuary, irrespective of your race, your creed, your faith. And this is in the 4th century, so
That's extraordinary.
It's truly an extraordinary thing. And I think that really gives the city this sort of, as I said, open-minded character, and a character where it's both heard of beyond its borders, but also it's a very nurturing and nourishing place. So refugees right across the story of the city come there. So from the 4th century, we then get refugees from the Battle of Manzikert with the Turks. Interestingly, in the early 20th century, in the kind of tumult of the First World War, huge numbers of Muslim refugees go to the city. And I think I've got I've just got this little image I'd like to show you. I think it's so touching, this picture. So these are young orphan children, Muslim children from the villages and towns outside Istanbul, who basically got caught up in the terrible chaos of the First World War and the build-up to the First World War. And they had nowhere to go, but we know that they knew from the folklore of their villages and from what people had talked about the city being a city that was open to refugees, that if they made their way to Istanbul, somebody would give them sanctuary. So you can probably see here these little children at the front, and they're being put up in the great grand mosques in the centre of the city. These are their blankets drying behind them, and we know that some of these children lived there for 1, 2, even 3 years.
Good
so
heavens.
I think that really matters. You know, I think that's why it was a city that was strong, because it was a city that was open to giving charity and to welcoming in those that sometimes people push away.
There's a character, I have to mention her because you write about her so beautifully and lucidly in this, and she has vibrancy. Can you tell us a little bit about, somebody assumes a heroine of yours, Theodora?
Yes, yeah. So you'd have to indulge me. So,
Please.
Some of you will know that I'm a great champion of kind of women in the story of history, and there's this amazing character called Theodora, who ends up the Empress of Byzantium. Theodora is quite a fruity character, shall we say. I'll be very circumspect because it's the afternoon and there are children in the audience. She starts off right at the bottom of the pile. She's a dancer, in inverted commas, and grown-ups in the audience will know what I mean. But she ends up being the Empress of Byzantium. So it's an incredible story of social mobility. She's very beautiful. She's also clearly very, very smart. And she attracts the attention of the Emperor Justinian, who changes the law so that an emperor can marry an actress, again in inverted commas, and the two of them are catnip to one another. They are this power couple who find huge inspiration in one another, but because she started right at the bottom of the pile, what's amazing is that she institutionalizes social justice and care for the poor and the meek and the needy and the weak. So she sets up safe houses for single mothers. You know, this is in the 6th century AD. It's so ahead of its time. She changes the law so that there are higher penalties for rape. There's a kind of brilliant law that she institutes where husbands have to ask their wives twice if they can get into debt, which you sort of feel must be something that happened to her. But I mean, how progressive is that? It's a fantastic thing.
I like the twice, just in case they get the wife drunk the first time and she says yes, whilst under the influence, they have to ask a second time.
Exactly.
That's smart.
It's very smart. So she's an amazing role model for the city, Theodora. And again, she worships in religious refugees to her palace, to her personal quarters of her palace. And we know this. This is Theodora here in the middle from that beautiful mosaic at Ravenna. We know that she welcomed in refugees because there's a fantastic letter from a builder who's really annoyed. It's a classic kind of moany builder letter when he says that he's been brought in because he's had to repair the floor because she's welcomed in so many women and children, refugees, that the floor has collapsed. And he's going, I can't believe it. You know, they don't know what they're doing. But as I said, she puts her money where her mouth is, Theodora.
I've never known whether this is true or not, but I've always laboured under the misapprehension, perhaps, that the Vikings made it as far as Constantinople, Istanbul.
Yeah.
But can we come back to the time of Theodora, because you say she's important as a marker for the extensive international relations and connections that there were during her time.
Absolutely, that's right. So Theodora and Justinian decide that, again, this is only a city that can function if it recognises that it's a world city and that it keeps up diplomatic and trading relations with this part of the world. They have huge trading relations with Arabia, the province of Arabia, right the way over in wet, dismal old Britain. They keep up the trading and diplomatic communications there. There's this rather fantastic document that we have where the Emperor Justinian says that he's going to give subsidies to the barbarians of Britannia, which puts us in our place, and that he's having to give these kind of handouts to Britain. And we know, I don't know if I include it, actually, just if any of you know the Tintagel in Britain, in Cornwall, sort of famous as being the mythical seat of King Arthur. This is a representation of Tintagel at the time of Theodora and Justinian. And what's really fascinating about it is that a few years ago there was a fire on the headland of Tintagel which revealed all these buildings that you can see, the foundations of these buildings, and there were storerooms and warehouses and merchant stores taking in deliveries from Arabia and from Constantinople.
Really?
Right the way across.
And shipping tin, one would imagine, back to there.
Exactly.
That massive trading.
Exactly, shipping tin right the way back to the east. And the incredible thing is that in this headland, there was a scrub fire, which is what cleared the archaeology. And just in that tiny headland alone, there is more Byzantine pottery than there is anywhere else in the rest of Western Europe, just in that headland alone. So that's a huge amount of trade and goods and ideas, again, being traded across the waves. So I love Theodora because she kind of kept an eye on what was going on. There was mercy and charity within her kingdom, but she really kept communication going with those beyond too.
Oh, how we need a Theodora now.
We need a Theodora in every way.
We're running shy on time, but of course we cannot think of modern Turkey, modern Istanbul. Perhaps you could draw us through the name change. But can we talk about the rise of Islam and the introduction of Islam into this city?
Absolutely. So of course, for 500 years, this is a glorious Islamic city. And right at the very beginning, in 628, so even before the Quran is compiled, there's a beautiful surah which talks about the good relationships between those of Byzantium and Islamic forces. over time, then clearly that disintegrates briefly because there are sieges, 13 Arabic sieges of Constantinople. Finally, in 1453, it becomes this glorious Islamic city when the Ottomans take over. But again, I think what's so important for us is to remember that this isn't a clash of civilizations, as it's so often described in the textbooks. If you look, there's a huge amount of collaboration and communication from Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and what's left of the Byzantine controllers. So they've sort of almost arranged a regime change rather than it being this kind of blood and thunder takeover. And you see that in all kinds of ways. I'll just show you, I'll just kind of flick through. So this is kind of one example of why there's huge amounts of collaboration between Islamic Istanbul and the rest of Europe. That this is actually a sketchbook from none other than Leonardo da Vinci. And what it shows is Leonardo da Vinci's sketches for a bridge that he wants to build in Istanbul, because one of the sultans has put out a bridge building competition and asked for kind of all the great aspiring architects of the day. And the kind of fantastic thing is Leonardo really wanted to win this project. So this is a sketchbook, and you can see these are his ideas for the bridge down below.
Yeah.
And we also know that he writes a letter to the Sultan. I'll just read you out very briefly. I know we're slightly short of time, but it has the kind of amazing hubris of Leonardo. Leonardo was a genius, but not a man without ego, I would say. And this is what he writes to the Sultan of Istanbul. I, your servant, have heard that you intend to construct a bridge from Istanbul to Galata, so that's across the Golden Horn. But you could not, because no sufficient expert could be found. I, your servant, I know how to make it. I could raise an arch so high that nobody would pass under it. I will construct it in such a way that even a sailing ship could pass under it. I am the man for your job. So Leonardo basically thinks it's a kind of done and dusted deal.
Does he get it?
He doesn't even get a reply to that letter. So that letter sits in this pile, that's why we've got it, in this pile of kind of unanswered mail in the Sultan's inbox, because he's obviously going, Leonardo, who really impressed me. So anyway, so I think it's, again, it's something we should remember, that it's a city that changes in many ways, but actually in its kind of open-minded and collaborative nature, it doesn't change once it's the Ottoman city.
Just quickly, because of course we cannot think of current Istanbul without thinking of Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia. When was that built? Who commissioned it?
So it was built right the way back originally. We actually now think by Constantine the Great.
Oh, is it really?
It was that early, and then Justinian and Theodora rebuilt it.
Well, of course, it was Christian, and then it became.
It was a Christian church, and then it is converted. But I mean, there's huge. Sinan, of course, is this incredible architect in the city of Istanbul who takes great inspiration from the Greek and Armenian craftsmen there, but builds this extraordinary skyline for the Islamic city. And this I just wanted to show you one example. So this is the one, of course, Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. And again, we've done some work on that incredible dome. And we now know that Sinan put into the dome 254 inverted wine jars into the top of the dome, so that he could create what we now call a Helmholtz resonator, which was kind of incredible acoustics. So it meant that when prayer was said inside the mosque, it would be reverberated.
Natural amplification.
Absolutely, and that the name of Allah would resound around the mosque. And people, visitors, talk about it, going in it being this space that was saturated with sound and the beauty of prayer. So it's a city where innovation was incredibly important as a result of people crossing over ideas.
I'm going to end on this question. I think it's perhaps one of the more important ones that we need to wrap up on. I'd love to be able to talk about it as a spy capital. People can find it from the book. Come and talk to Bettany while you're getting your book signed later on. But can you tell us a little bit, and I know this is something dear to your heart, about the role of women during the Ottoman period?
Yes, with absolute pleasure. So that was another building of Sinan, which I'll just say that if you go to Istanbul, you can go and have a hammam in his newly restored hammam. So these are the women of Istanbul. These are the women of the harem. And as with Theodora, the female rulers of the city were very influential. They were very important. And within the harem, they had real political influence. And I'll just finish with one very brief example. And again, I'd have to say I do think this is one of the reasons the city has strength, is because it has the good heads and good minds of women contributing to the success
Holding up their half of the sky.
Exactly, holding up their half of the sky. But I think my very favourite female character from Istanbul is this wonderful woman called Safiye, who is the mother of the Sultan. And at this time, you could not be a more powerful woman. She's called the Valide. She holds huge influence. And we know that Safiye actually had direct communication with Elizabeth I of England. And basically, the two, so imagine Safiye is in the harem, and you know, she starts out life as a concubine, she ends up the mother of the Sultan. But Safiye and Elizabeth I of England have this beautiful correspondence. They send one another gifts, and then basically they say, look, we think the men are slightly mucking up the politics, so we'll just sort this out between us. You know, we know a bit of common sense is needed here. So they negotiate all kinds of things. They negotiate diplomatic trading deals, the release of pirates. So they write very formally, and then I'll just finish with one wonderful PS that they have. So this is Safiye writing from the harem to Elizabeth I. Your letter has arrived and reached us. God willing, dear friend, action will be taken according to what you said. So Safiye is basically saying, don't worry about it, it's sorted, you know, we'll do what you want. May we always be firm in friendship. God willing, may our friendship never die. And then, dare I say, that being two women, they've done the international political business, and they then start to trade makeup tips. It's absolutely, so they've sorted out geopolitics, and then this is the PS at the end of the letter. On account of your majesty's being a woman, I hear that there are to be found in your English kingdom rare distilled waters for every kind for the face and odoriferous oils for the hands. Your Majesty Elizabeth would favour me by sending some of them to me by my hand, for this the most serene queen, by my hands alone, because she's obviously realised if all these lovely kind of lavender hand lotions come in, some of the other women in the harem might nick them, basically. Just to my hand, because she, Safiye, does not wish them to pass through other hands. So it's a tiny thing. It's just a postscript in a letter. But for me, it kind of sums up the brio and the brilliance of the city, and why, when we're looking at how we make better cities today, we need to take note of some of these examples, where it's a place where women as well as men can have a say, where there's collaboration and communication and a delight in innovation, as well as an intense understanding of the past.
Imagine how different the world would be right now if President Trump traded shaving tips with President Xi from China. How much easier that would be.
Maybe they're doing that right now.
Can we just have the women ruling the world for the next 20 years? We desperately need it. Betty, just 1 second. I'm going to ask you what was that? Spy capital of the world in a couple of lines.
Yes. So this was a place, because it was so cosmopolitan, it came to be called the spy capital of the world. And the rather brilliant thing, which I think I have an image of. Here we are. Perfect. So the first ever spy camera was invented in Istanbul. Mm-hmm. And this is not just a spy camera. It was actually a button on someone's lapel. So for good and for bad, they were great innovators. But as I said, I think we should remember them as a city that is cosmopolitan, that teaches us what it is to be a world citizen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bettany Hughes is an utter genius. She writes fantastically. She's a superb communicator. All of this we know. She's also a very gifted storyteller, and I think you found that out today. But the one thing she's really good at is superb, first-class, world-class research. 10 years to write this. It'll take you about 10 months to read it. You will enjoy every single page. Ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful Bettany Hughes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bettany.
Thank you.
Bless you.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Bettany will be signing just outside here. If you want to come by, copy of the book, have a chat with Bettany, get her to sign it, come and join us in the signing room just to the left of the stage.
Great. And stay here for the next session, which I'm going to come and listen to as well.
Okay, cool. Yes, well, we'll see you back here shortly. Thank you, Bettany.